What if everything you've heard about the origins of the German people was invented before we ever had the science to question it? For centuries, we believed we knew where Germans came from. From medieval chronicles to modern nationalism, the myth echoed loud that there was a single origin, a distinct, unbroken people, Germanic by blood, language, and destiny. But then came the genome, and the story began to fall apart. In 2015, a groundbreaking ancient DNA study by Haak et al. Sent shockwaves through European history. It revealed that the corded ware people of Germany, thought to be early Germanic ancestors, weren't native at all. They were newcomers. Carrying up to 75% Yamnaya Steppe ancestry, they descended from a massive migration out of the Pontic Caspian steppe around 3000 BC. Their arrival changed everything: bloodlines, languages, power. And they weren't the first. Before them, around 5500 BC, early Neolithic farmers arrived from Anatolia. They brought agriculture, domesticated animals, and a new genetic signature. These early European farmers, labelled EEF in modern genetics, spread across Central Europe, replacing most local hunter-gatherers, but not entirely. Even earlier still, the land belonged to the Western hunter-gatherers, Ice Age survivors, whose DNA still lingers in German genomes today. 3 ancient layers, each one buried under the next, each one rewriting what we thought we knew. So, when we talk about German blood, what does that even mean? Is it the steppe herder with a battle axe, the Anatolian farmer planting wheat, or the forest hunter chasing deer in the shadow of retreating glaciers? Modern genetics says it's all of them. Germany is not a nation of one tribe. It's a crossroads, genetically, geographically, historically. And yet, despite this overwhelming evidence, the myth of the singular German bloodline still lingers, in textbooks, in politics, in ancestry kits that draw sharp lines on blurred maps. But to find the true beginning, we must go deeper. Before there were invaders, before the warrior kings, there were people who lived quietly, planting, building, and disappearing. Who were these first forgotten settlers? And why did history nearly erase them? They brought wheat, pottery, and family, but vanished from history. Who were the first settlers of Germany? And this is where their story begins. Long before tribes roamed the forests, before warriors carved borders into blood and stone. Central Europe belonged to a people without kings, without armies, without monuments. They didn't forge swords, they forged bread. They didn't speak Germanic or Slavic, they spoke through harvests. Around 5500 BC, a wave of migrants swept across the Balkans and into the heart of Europe. They came from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and with them they carried the first farms in human history. Archaeologists call them the linear pottery culture, or LBK. Geneticists call their legacy early European farmer ancestry, or EEF. These Anatolian farmers transformed everything. They built long houses, cleared forests, buried their dead with pottery and flowers. They brought domesticated wheat, barley, cattle, and the quiet revolution of permanence. No more chasing deer across freezing hills. Now, families could stay. Generations could take root. Civilization could begin. But their arrival came with cost. Within a few hundred years, they had largely replaced the indigenous Western hunter-gatherers. The blue-eyed, dark-haired people who had lived here for millennia. Yet genetics reveals something stranger. By the late Neolithic, those hunter-gatherer genes re-emerge. Up to 25% of EEF genomes now carried WHG ancestry. How? Why? Did they intermarry, resist, assimilate? We don't fully know. Because despite their monumental impact, these first farmers vanish from memory. No national epic sings their name. No origin myth remembers their temples or gods. And yet their DNA is in millions of modern Germans. They planted the seeds, but others would claim the harvest. We walk on their bones. We build on their ruins. But history skips their chapter, as if civilization began with the sword, not the seed. Hark et al., 2015, showed EEF populations expanding west from Anatolia. They introduced agriculture across Europe and mixed with WHG over time. PubMed ID 257-31166. But their disappearance wasn't fate. It was interrupted. Because just beyond the Carpathians, a force was building. And it would arrive on horseback, carrying not wheat, but fire. What if the German language, warrior culture, and even family structure came from the open grasslands of Ukraine, and when it came, it didn't knock? Around 3000 BC, the land trembled, not from earthquakes, but from hooves, thunder across the steppe, wagons creaking, axes glinting. The Yamnaya were coming. They weren't farmers, they were herders, riders, warriors. And they brought with them something Europe had never seen before: speed. In less than a few centuries, they surged into Central Europe, into what is now Germany. And what happened next was not quiet blending. It was a genetic overhaul. Burial sites from the corded ware culture dated between 2900 and 2350 BC reveal something staggering. Up to 75% of their DNA came from Yamnaya ancestors. That's not an influence, that's a replacement. They brought the R1b haplogroup, now one of the most common paternal lines in Germany. They brought horses, wagons, and new tools of war. They brought hierarchy, male-dominated clans, territorial chiefs, ancestral loyalty sealed in stone graves. But the biggest weapon they carried wasn't metal. It was language. The Yamnaya are believed to have spoken a Proto-Indo-European tongue, the root of most modern European languages, including German. They didn't just bring blood, they brought the voice that would echo across millennia, a whisper that would become war cries, folk songs, and finally, the word Deutsch. This was more than migration, it was cultural reprogramming, and in the silence of those ancient barrows, filled with grave goods and crowned skulls, you can still feel it. A takeover so complete it wrote itself into our mouths. But not everyone surrendered. Not all of Germany bowed to the riders of the steppe. Because in the shadows of the Alps, another identity was still breathing. It spoke in gold, in salt, in secrets buried in mountain graves. The Yamnaya stormed the heartland, but the south whispered in Celtic. Southern Germany speaks German, but its DNA whispers in Celtic. And that whisper? It's still echoing. Because under the forests of Bavaria, beneath the vineyards of Baden-Württemberg, lies a different Germany. One that doesn't march to the beat of the steppe. One that remembers a softer, older rhythm. Here the soil hides gold, bronze, salt, and silence. From around 800 BC, this region flourished under the Hallstatt culture, the heart of what archaeologists now call the early Celtic world. They carved their lives into hill forts. They buried their dead in oak chambers, surrounded by chariots and jewellery. And they salted the earth. Literally. With mines so deep, they preserved entire wooden staircases for 2,500 years. But it wasn't just wealth, it was wisdom. These weren't savages in skins. They were metalworkers, traders, priests, connected from Iberia to Bohemia, Their graves stretch from the Rhone to the Danube, and their DNA lives on. Modern genomic studies, like Gretzinger et al. 2024, reveal that modern Bavarians carry up to 65% of their ancestry from this Celtic foundation. That's not a footnote, that's a legacy. But here's the contradiction. The language, gone. The myths, lost. By the time the Roman Empire rose, the Celtic tongues of Germany had faded, replaced by Latin, then Germanic. Today the people of southern Germany speak a language born on the steppe, but carry the blood of hilltop kings, the descendants of salt lords, and artisans whose patterns shaped Iron Age Europe. You won't find Celtic on their passports, but it's in their chromosomes. A forgotten voice, still humming under every Bavarian lullaby. But as the south held on to its ancient whispers, the north was already moving towards something colder, darker and sharper. Because across the rivers and marshlands another identity was forming, one born not from gold or salt, but from storms and steel. How did Vikings, Saxons and Angles turn northern Germany into Scandinavia's cousin? And in the north, it wasn't whispers that shaped identity. It was wind and waves and war. Northern Germany between the Elbe and Schleswig became something rare, not just a borderland, but a genetic and cultural echo chamber for Scandinavia. Modern genetic studies, like those by Schiffels et al. 2016, show that haplogroups I1 and R1b-U106, dominant in Scandinavia, also surge in northern Germans, not by chance, by centuries of contact and shared blood. This wasn't a one-time invasion, it was generational osmosis. By 500 BC, the Astolf culture emerged, seen by many as the cradle of the early Germanic world. They lived simply, iron blades, cremation graves, no elaborate burial wagons, but something stronger, continuity. Their settlements connect with those of southern Denmark and coastal Sweden. Not just through trade, but through language, myth and family. These weren't just neighbours, they were kin. And it didn't stop there. By the 1st century AD, Tacitus writes of the Saxons, Angles and Jutes, all settled in northern Germany and southern Denmark. Over the next 500 years, these same groups would invade Roman Britain, helping create what we now call England. Their dialects would become Old English. Their gods, Woden, Thuna, Frigg, would shape early medieval belief. Their genetic fingerprint remains in both Britain and in modern northern Germans. And then came the Vikings. By the 8th century, maritime networks explode. Not just raids, but migration, intermarriage and settlements from Norway and Denmark into Frisia, Saxony and along the Elbe. This wasn't a frontier anymore. It was a fusion zone. Northern Germany became a mirror of the north, its identity carved not in stone or empire, but in wind, wood and water. But as ships sailed west, another wave was silently moving westward, across forests, fields, and forgotten borders. Because the east was never empty, and the people waiting there had names, languages, and legacies that would leave deep scars on the German genome. What happens when tribes vanish, and new ones claim their land? And when the Germanic tribes marched west, into Roman lands, into legend, into empire, they didn't just leave their villages. They left a vacuum, a silence, a space waiting to be filled. And it was, not by one people, but by many. They came slowly, then all at once, speaking Slavic tongues, planting different seeds, building fires in forests that once belonged to Goths and Saxons. By the 6th century AD, the Slavic migration into Central Europe had begun, not with armies, but with settlement, family by family, clan by clan, the archaeological record doesn't lie. From Mecklenburg to Saxony, new pottery appears, hand-formed, stamped with Slavic motifs, burials shift, house plans change, old Germanic longhouses give way to Slavic-style sunken huts, Grubenhäuser. This wasn't destruction, it was replacement, and under the soil, the DNA agrees. Modern genetic analysis shows that Eastern Germans carry high levels of R1a, a Y-DNA haplogroup strongly associated with Slavic populations. Studies like Virama et al. 2018 confirm that these genetic signatures cluster more closely with modern Poles, Czechs and Slovaks than with Western Germans. But one group stayed visible, the Sorbs of Lusatia, a Slavic-speaking minority still living in Eastern Germany today, are a living bridge. Their genetics link them more to Western slaves than their German neighbours, yet they've survived conquest, assimilation, even Nazi-era suppression. And then came the pushback. From the 12th to 14th centuries, the German-led Ostsiedlung tried to reverse the tide. Mass migrations, cities like Leipzig and Berlin expanded eastward. Slavic names vanished from maps. Churches replaced pagan shrines. But the genome never forgets. Even now in East German DNA, the Slavic presence still breathes. Because history erases stories, but blood remembers. And just as genes were blending quietly beneath the soil, above ground, empires were beginning to carve new truths in stone. Borders would rise, kingdoms would clash, but in the middle, Germany would fracture and keep fracturing. What if Rome ruled your land, but not your DNA? And somewhere in that fracture, Rome arrived, not with roots, but with roads, not with ancestry, but with architecture, not to become the land, but to use it. By 15 BC, Roman legions had crossed the Alps. They pushed into what is now southern Germany, building the edge of empire. They called it the Limes Germanicus, a frontier of forts, watchtowers, trading posts stretching over 500 kilometres from the Rhine to the Danube. Stone by stone, Latin law and Roman wine flowed north. Towns like Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, modern-day Cologne, rose from the marshes, bathhouses, temples, amphitheatres. It looked like Rome. It sounded like Rome. But genetically, it wasn't Rome. A 2024 genome study out of Stanford Medical School, analysing remains from Roman outposts in Germania Superior and Raetia, revealed something stunning. Roman military DNA is barely present in modern southern Germans. They ruled, they built, but they didn't stay. Roman soldiers rarely reproduced with locals. Some were rotated back to distant provinces, others died far from home. Even in Austrian Roman outposts, places like Carnuntum, DNA links show more connections to British Isles or North Africa than to the native population. But those traces disappear. Because what Rome brought wasn't blood, it was culture without kinship. Germanic tribes absorbed Roman laws, calendar systems, even some gods, but not the genes. This wasn't assimilation, it was a theatre. Rome cast its shadow long. But in the DNA of modern Germans, the light passes through untouched. And then, just like that, Rome collapsed. The roads crumbled, the legions left, but the maps were redrawn again, and this time not by emperors but by migrations, because what came next wasn't an invasion, it was an explosion. A medieval remix of tribes, languages and alliances that would reshape the entire face and genome of Germany. What does it mean when 12 million people change countries overnight? And it didn't happen in ancient times. It happened just yesterday. In the memory of grandparents, a human explosion. After World War II, between 1944 and 1950, something happened that has no historical parallel in modern Europe. 12.5 million ethnic Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Baltics were forced to flee or violently expelled from the east. They didn't pack their bags, they were dragged across frozen roads, through minefields, sometimes with cattle, sometimes with corpses. Whole towns vanished, church bells silenced, cemeteries abandoned. These weren't soldiers, they were women, children, grandparents, refugees of blood, not politics. And yet this mass trauma left something behind, not in stone, but in genomes. Because when these millions arrived in what became West Germany, they didn't just bring grief. They brought DNA from the east, from Sorbian enclaves, Baltic outposts, Hungarian plains. They carried Slavic and Baltic haplogroups, pushing them westward into places that had been genetically isolated since the Middle Ages. Studies published in Nature Communications 2020 show a sudden uptick in East Central European genetic markers in areas like Lower Saxony and Hesse, directly tied to this wave of post-war displacement. And with them came new dialects, new foods, buried memories. You could erase a town, but not the chromosomes it carried. And that's the contradiction. In trying to purify borders, history did the opposite. It made German more mixed, more diverse, more haunted. This wasn't just a demographic event, it was a redefinition, a shattering of old identities and the silent creation of new ones. Because in the ashes of the empire, Germany didn't rebuild with stone, it was rebuilt with people, and every new settler carried old DNA. But while maps were redrawn after the war, ancient truths still slept beneath those footprints, because just beneath those refugee trails lay bones thousands of years older, waiting to rewrite everything. One tribe resisted conquest, assimilation, and even genetics. But not all survival happens underground. Some endure above the surface, in plain sight, whispering in foreign tongues, surrounded by foreign names. In eastern Germany, nestled between Saxony and Brandenburg, there lives a people who were never meant to remain. The Sorbs, a Slavic-speaking community, surrounded entirely by Germans. Their towns speak German. Their neighbours marry German. Their borders say Deutschland. But listen closer, and you'll hear Wendish hymns, Slavic proverbs, and church bells that ring in another memory. They shouldn't exist. Centuries of reproduction, from medieval crusades to Nazi suppression, tried to erase them. The 1870s saw Germanization policies. The 20th century saw their language outlawed in schools, and yet today it survives, and so does their DNA. Mitochondrial studies and whole genome analyses show that Sorbs cluster closely with Czechs and Western Poles, not with other Germans. Even after centuries of intermarriage and proximity, their autosomal profiles remain distinct. A genetic island, inside a nation, and it's not just genes. Their burial rites preserve pagan echoes. Their traditional dress mirrors patterns found east of the Oder River. Their folk songs still sing of homelands never claimed by Germany. Every ritual, every custom is an act of defiance. Because the Sorbs didn't vanish. They adapted, survived, and somehow preserved a living window into early medieval Central Europe. Not in a museum, not in a textbook, but in living blood and spoken breath. They are the past, still breathing. But just when you think borders and identities could still be drawn on a map, science throws a final surprise. Because Germany's borders may be sharp, but its DNA blurs them into something far more mysterious. Your passport says Germany, but your DNA may say something else entirely. And if you were to zoom in, not with a drone, but with a microscope, Germany doesn't look like a country at all. It looks like a gradient, no walls, no hard lines, just waves and echoes. Take a cheek swab in Schleswig-Holstein and your DNA might lean toward Denmark or even the Netherlands. Head south to Bavaria and the picture tilts, pulling closer to Austrian or Swiss ancestry with deeper traces of early European farmers. To the east, that same genetic thread knots up, pulling in centuries of Slavic admixture. From the Sorbian enclaves of Lusatia to the shifting borderlands of Silesia and Pomerania, the markers left behind are unmistakable, and yet it's not chaos. Biobank studies like KORA, SHIP, and POPGEN, analysing tens of thousands of samples, reveal something haunting. Germans don't fall into categories, they drift. A recent study from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, 2022, showed that German DNA forms gradients, long, subtle lines that bleed from one region into another like watercolour on wet paper. Even the Y-DNA haplogroups, the paternal bloodlines, resist borders. R1b-U106 dominant in the west and north. I1 heavy in the north and coastal zones, echoing Norse roots. R1a strongest in the east, a whisper from Slavic roots. There is no singular German genome, no centre, no core, and yet the illusion of uniformity still sells. A single flag, a language, a people. But genetics doesn't care about identity papers. It reveals what history tried to flatten. A patchwork, a spectrum, a contradiction. And if that's true, what exactly are we looking at when we see our own ancestry results? Because behind every ethnicity percentage is a war, a migration, or a lie waiting to be uncovered. What if Germany isn't a nation, but a genetic archive of all of Europe? Because behind every ethnicity percentage is a war, a migration, or a lie waiting to be uncovered. And in the middle of that chaos sits Germany. Not as a monolith, not even as a nation, but as a mosaic. A place where history didn't happen once. It happened over and over, layered like ash in the soil. Every empire passed through it, but none stayed pure, none untouched. The Yamnaya riders from the Ukrainian steppe thundered through, leaving their R1b haplogroups behind. The Anatolian farmers carved out the first fields, and their blood still whispers in the southern genome. Celtic smiths melted bronze in mountain caves. Roman legions marched roads that went nowhere in the DNA. Slavic tribes, Sorbian survivors, Viking traders, medieval migrants, war refugees, each one left something. Each one lost something. Germany became a crossroads. But more than that, it became a mirror. Because inside every modern German genome, there is no straight line. There are fractures, forks, paths that loop back to Poland or France or the Black Sea, echoes of dialects no longer spoken, fragments of languages carved out by tongue and sword. And still, the story isn't finished, because every genome carries silence, the trauma that doesn't get written, the migrations no one remembered, the surnames that vanished in fire, the dialects buried in policy, and yet this is the twist, the deepest one. Most Germans today, genetically, are closer to their neighbours than to their distant cousins across the country. Closer to Dutch in the west, Slavs in the east, Austrians in the south. Germany wasn't isolated, it was entangled. And maybe that's the truth DNA forces us to see. That identity is not a wall, it's a bridge. And your genome, it doesn't decide who you are, but it tells you where you began. Next time, what happened when Viking blood met the DNA of the Roman Empire?